as I finished Prince Caspian, I did that knowing that I wanted to sort of change direction, and this came to me at the end of filming Prince Caspian, and it just really spoke to me.
What particularly spoke to you in it?
Well, it's a combination of things. On a personal level, I related to a lot of the characters. I'd grown up in Papua New Guinea. On reading it, I sort of identified with and knew a lot of the characters straight away. And then on another level, it spoke to me as I said earlier, story about story. And as somebody who's chosen to do that as a vocation, it was great to find this thing that really talked about the power of story. And I believe we dream in stories. We tell stories. We meet with our friends. We tell jokes. Story is such an important part of every culture. And so a book that really spoke to that sort of resonated with me.
And what about imagination? There's a lot of reference to imagination in here.
Yeah, there is. And I was lucky enough to grow up in a family where imagination was considered a positive thing. And I think it is. And obviously imagination, as the book and the movie illustrates, can be good and bad. There's a lot of imagination that can cause harm, and fiction can be very dangerous in a situation like this. But I think it's an important part of who we are, and a part of it allows us that redemptive chance to reinvent ourselves, which is what Great Expectations speaks of as well.
So, Matilda, has she managed to reinvent herself at the end of this?
Matilda has. Matilda has actually, to some degree, become a combination of her mother and Mr. Watts. When we first looked at making this film, and we were trying to figure out how to make it, I looked at options of shooting in the Solomon Islands where there was some accommodation, or shooting in Australia and building a village, in Queensland, and all those kind of things. When I got to Bougainville and started talking to the people, just when I'd gone up there as sort of a logistics fact-finding mission, and seeing if we could cast out of there. And Bougainville's an island of about 160,000 people, and the Solomon group is quite ethnically different from just about anywhere else in the Pacific. So I knew it was limited in casting and so on. When I got up there, it became very important, very obvious to me how important it was for them to tell the story, and how important it was for them, as a country that's now reinventing itself, for that to be an important theme. And the book does not make a big issue about Matilda going back home, but the more I interacted with the people of Bougainville, the more it became apparent that the movie had to, that it was important, because a lot of people left during this crisis, and they're in they're in the state of trying to create their own government and become independent from Papua New Guinea now, and they need those people back.
Yeah, the other theme is the whole idea of home.
Yeah.
And particularly in Mr. Pip's life. I mean, where do you think is home for him?
Mr. Watts?
Mr. Watts.
Yeah, I think he found home in Bougainville, but I think his home was connected. I think his home was connected to people, and I think his home was connected to Grace, which is why he couldn't really leave until she was ready to leave, or obviously passed on. But for him, again, I think Matilda offered him a chance of redemption. He realized choices he'd made in his life had done a lot of harm. And he saw in Matilda sort of a kindred spirit, and saw a chance to actually redeem himself by saving her.
How did he get his will out of Bougainville?
I think he gave it to Mr. Massoy, who was the boatman.
Okay.
It only appeared after the crisis.
I see. Okay. You have 3 roles in this film. We're going to throw it open to questions in a little while, so when I run out of questions, I'm going to ask you to ask some questions. You have 3 roles in this film. You're the director, the producer, or one of the producers, and the writer. Which was the most difficult?
Gosh, probably the writing in some ways, partly because the book was very dense and multi-layered. And when I first read it, I felt like it was very cinematic, but when I came to breaking it down, I realized that, Lloyd writes very beautifully in wonderful prose, and he leads you down these paths, and when you have to break it down structurally, and you're going inside a head, inside several different stories, the stories of the mind, the story of Matilda, the story of Great Expectations, and that balance was very tricky. And writing is a dark time because there's only yourself. And I like to think that throughout the rest of the process, obstacles are thrown up in front of you, but they're external usually, and you're fighting against things outside of yourself. When you're writing, you're fighting with yourself. So I find that sort of, in some ways, the most difficult part.
How long was the writing process?
it differs. In this case, I fought with myself for way too long before I shared it. And it was one of the lessons from doing this. The next adaptation I wrote, I sort of scribbled it out quickly and immediately gave it to somebody else. But this process, and to some degree, the writing process wasn't even finished till the end of the editing, because it was a difficult film to edit as well. And I knew a lot of the structure would ultimately be defined in editing. So, the writing process initially was, I don't know, somewhere between 6 months and a year. But then it sort of was ongoing.
Yeah. Some people say that there are really three films. There's the film you write, the film you shoot, and the film you edit. And there's no necessary relationship between those three things. Is the film you ended up with the same film you imagined in the beginning?
It's very similar, but it's not the same. I think the film is ultimately made in editorial. Up till that point, you're figuring out which bits you need, and you're collecting the bits you need. And I've been amazed with my own films how much you could change them in the edit room. And this one changed many times.
You got Hugh Laurie to give a good performance in the editing room, I suspect, right?
Not at all. No. I mean, Hugh is one of those people that is just so incredibly versatile. And I've followed him since way back in the Fry and Laurie and Blackadder days, and when he did House, that was to me such a testament to what a versatile actor he was, and how wonderfully he could do in this situation. And he gave himself to the role. He lived up there in a tiny boat. He rowed a canoe to work every day. One of the things I loved, so we had normal call sheets, and the call sheets list who's going to arrive at what time and all those kind of things, and who's going to get them there. And our call sheet used to say, Hugh Laurie, transportation, Hugh's canoe. And he rowed his canoe to work every morning.
So he went native.
Yeah, pretty much. He got into the role. But there are three major stories. At one stage I had a lot more of Great Expectations in there, and found I was trying to tell too much of it, and it was hard to follow which story you should follow. The story of the mine and the politics of the mine, when I came to writing this, I found it was such a great story in itself, such a fascinating, interesting, and challenging story that could very easily overwhelm it. And I really wanted to keep it to Matilda's personal story. So it was a matter of balancing. You put too much Great Expectations in, it's too weighted. You put not enough in, and it leaves too many questions. Sometimes if you're just in the middle, you kind of tell so much that people want to know more. So that became a very iterative thing to try and figure out the balance.
Yeah. Well, also when you adapt a book, part of the problem is what to leave out, as opposed to what to put in. And I imagine you had to leave out quite a lot.
Yeah, and it's just such a beautifully written book. I mean, it really is very eloquently written. There's a lot that's left out. I mean, I think people who know the book, watch the film, and do feel like the book is true to the film is true to the book, and it's a very similar experience. The author Lloyd is incredibly happy with the movie, but there are things you leave out. There are things you change. One of the big, Lloyd was very supportive and said to me right at the beginning, it's my book, it's your film. But I kept him involved throughout the process, and I got to the point when Matilda was going back to Australia, and I realized that in the book she becomes a Dickensian scholar. And I couldn't get her there, and I called Lloyd and I said, look, I can't get Matilda to pick up the book. This book almost destroyed her. And he said, I can see why you feel that way. So I didn't have that problem with my Matilda, but I can see why you did. Why don't you follow that and see where it goes? So there are things that just naturally change through having a different experience coming to it. The visualization of Great Expectations is something I could do in the movie that he couldn't do in the book. So that's very different. So that's why it's it's an adaptation, not a translation, so to speak.
So directing live action as opposed to animation, where you could always redraw whatever it is you wanted. Was that a problem here? I mean, one of the things about shooting a film on such a distant location, and a remote location, is you can't always go back and pick up a shot.
And you can't predict a lot. In animation, you think about everything, every dust particle and every footfall, every raindrop, it's there deliberately. In live action, the curse and the blessing of it is there's a lot that happens by accident. You sometimes have to roll with the weather. You have to roll with the fact that you didn't anticipate that everyone needed to go to their gardens to pick vegetables that morning when you planned an extra scene with 300 people. There's a lot of stuff you don't expect. You don't realize that when you invite the flute players from another village, you're meant to send out a tuning stick first, because otherwise you commit a huge cultural faux pas and no one shows up. So that kind of thing makes it harder, but at the same time more thrilling.
How large was your crew?
We brought about 40 people, I think, between 40 and 50 people at the maximum. We used a lot of local people. We sort of upskilled a lot of local people. The village itself had a sort of resident population of, I would say, around 120. They had a listed population of about 500, but about 120 people lived there most of the time.
And they have a film industry?
No. No, there were in the Bougainvillean part of the film, there were two people who had acted before, and that was Hugh Laurie and one of the soldiers who had trained in NIDA. Most other people had never seen a movie camera before at all.
So how did you work them as actors?
A lot of the time it wasn't so much acting as reenacting. Most of these people, certainly the older ones, had lived through this 20 years prior. When we burned down the church and you see a tall gentleman who's standing in the crowd praying, the church we built based on a church on his island, and he was the chief of this island called Pok Pok right nearby, and that church got half burnt down when the army burnt down his house. So going into this, I was a little concerned over how this would work, that we were reenacting very traumatic events. What would it be like when we got people dressed in Papua New Guinea soldier uniforms with guns walking into the village? And what it became is, obviously it was very easy for them to tap into the emotions and relive them. And at the same time it became some kind of a trauma therapy, because they got to live them in a safe environment. And after these big events, we'd often sit around telling stories, singing, praying, whatever it was at the end of the day, to help them kind of exorcise these demons. And it became a very cathartic experience, but it also became like making a documentary at times. We weren't going to build more than one church. We set that church on fire and we rolled cameras for 40 minutes. And often people would get caught up in it and I'd have to run in and ask them to say their lines. But it was kind of combining drama and documentary.